"This bank is mine," said the stranger. It was just another quiet Thursday afternoon in Ridgeway, Ohio, when the glass doors of Oak Ridge National Bank swung open and an unexpected figure stepped inside. People in line turned, pausing mid-sentence or mid-transaction, their eyes narrowing in both curiosity and judgment. Standing at the entrance was a frail-looking, elderly black man, probably in his late 70s. He wore a faded olive coat patched at the elbows, scuffed leather shoes that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles, and carried a worn canvas sack slung over one shoulder. His name was Clarence J. Holman, though no one in the bank that day knew it. He didn't say a word at first, just walked slowly down the center of the lobby, each step quiet but certain. The marble floor echoed beneath him, amplifying his presence despite his humble appearance. He moved like a man who knew where he was going and why. Behind the teller counter, a young employee whispered to her coworker, "Did he wander in from the shelter or something?" The other teller chuckled under his breath, not even trying to hide it. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. One woman clutched her purse tighter. Another man looked down at his phone, hoping to avoid eye contact. Then Clarence stopped in the dead center of the bank. His eyes slowly scanned the room. Sharp, thoughtful eyes that didn't belong to someone lost or confused. The buzz of casual conversation and idle judgment faded into a low hush. Something about him made people pay attention, even if they didn't know why. He cleared his throat. His voice was low, gravelly from age, but steady. "This bank is mine." For a second, the room stood still. Then came the laughter. It started with a scoff from a man near the deposit slip stand. Then giggles from behind the counter. Even the security guard, tall, white, and built like a linebacker, let out a short, mocking breath through his nose before walking toward the old man. His name was Officer Bradley Knox, a no-nonsense type who'd worked security in the Ridgeway area for over a decade. He had seen all kinds of folks walk through those doors. None quite like Clarence. "All right, sir," Bradley said, resting his hand near his belt where his gun holster sat. "I'm gonna need you to head back outside. This isn't a place to make speeches." Clarence didn't move. His expression didn't change. "I'm not here to make a speech," he said, calm as ever. "I'm here to take back what belongs to me, something stolen from me over 50 years ago." That sentence hit the room like a dropped glass. The laughter died down, replaced with puzzled glances and murmurs. Clarence slowly lowered the canvas sack from his shoulder and set it gently on the floor, as if it carried more than just old belongings, as if it held a forgotten piece of history. Bradley stepped closer, a frown creasing his forehead. "Sir, I don't want to ask again. Whatever you think you're doing here, it's best you leave before this becomes a problem." But Clarence was already reaching into the bag. His fingers, wrinkled and calloused, moved with surprising steadiness. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. The silence stretched long and tight like a wire, the room watching his every move. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something else. Something heavier. Clarence Holman wasn't just another drifter, and this wasn't just another afternoon at the bank. Clarence J. Holman's fingers moved slowly, but with purpose, as he reached deep into the old canvas sack. The room, just moments ago filled with snickers and whispers, had gone utterly quiet. Even the rhythmic clicking of keyboards behind the teller line had stopped. The tension was thick. From the bag, Clarence pulled out a rectangular bundle wrapped in faded oilskin. He set it down gently on the nearest desk, one usually used for loan brochures, and began to unwrap it, corner by corner, revealing a weathered, yellowed ledger with cracked leather binding. Embossed on the cover, barely visible beneath the years of dust and wear, were the words, "Oak Ridge National Bank, Founding Ledger, 1963. Bradley Knox squinted, unsure of what he was seeing. Clarence opened the book slowly, his hands steady as stone. Inside were pages filled with handwritten entries in faded ink, loan records, transactions, signatures, dozens of them, all dating back 6 decades. But what made the room collectively lean forward was the first page. Clarence turned it toward the light. There, clear as day despite the aging paper, were 2 signatures: Clarence J. Holman and Elliot Radford, side by side beneath the title, Co-founders and original stakeholders of Oak Ridge National Bank. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few customers stepped closer, cautiously peeking at the page. The young teller who had mocked him earlier blinked hard, visibly confused. Even Officer Knox took a hesitant step toward the table, his hand no longer on his holster but resting on his hip now, fingers twitching uncertainly. "This ledger," Clarence said quietly but firmly, "is the original record. I helped build this bank from the ground up in 1963. Every dollar, every brick, every damn handshake." Someone near the front gasped. "No offense, sir," Knox said carefully, his voice lower now, "but that's a mighty big claim. Where's the proof that's not just an old book?" Clarence didn't answer with words. He reached back into the bag. This time, he pulled out a series of bundled bills, yellowed and cracked at the edges, old U.S. currency from the 1960s, each stamped with the original Oak Ridge National Bank seal. The bank hadn't used that logo since the early 70s when it was supposedly acquired by the Radford family, heirs of Elliot Radford, who had become its public owners ever since. Clarence looked directly at the young manager behind the front desk, Preston Radford, Elliot's grandson, no more than 30, and the public face of the bank today. "I was your grandfather's partner," Clarence said. "But when it came time to go public, he decided that the town wasn't ready for a black man at the helm of their bank. So he forged documents, erased my name from the records, and took it all." Preston's face had gone pale. "Sir, I've never heard any of this," he stammered. "There's no record of your name in the archives." "No, because your grandfather buried it," Clarence said, opening a third item from the bag. A notarized agreement, brittle but intact, dated April 17, 1963, signed and sealed by both men and 2 witnesses. It outlined the terms of their 50/50th partnership, including ownership rights. "I kept this in my house for 60 years, Clarence continued. "I never let go of it, because one day I knew I'd be back to set things right." Bradley Knox didn't know what to do. He looked over at Preston, whose hands were now visibly shaking as he flipped through the ledger pages. Behind them, bank employees were slowly gathering near the desk, eyes wide, breaths shallow. It was no longer just a claim. It was documented, signed, sealed, and real. "This can't be happening," someone whispered. But it was. And Clarence J. Holman stood there, proud and still, like a man who had waited half a century to be heard. Clarence J. Holman stood in silence for a long moment. The old ledger lay open on the desk, its pages whispering secrets the town of Ridgway had tried to forget. The yellowed bills, the signatures, the notarized documents, all of them sat quietly under the harsh fluorescent lights, speaking a truth more powerful than anything Clarence could say with words. But he spoke anyway, because it was time. "I was 28 when Elliot and I first met," Clarence began, his voice firm but low, gravelly with the weight of years. "He was from a wealthy family. I was just a young man with big dreams and a head full of numbers. We both saw opportunity in this town, a place that needed growth, stability, and something local folks could trust. So we built Oak Ridge National together." Everyone in the bank now stood still. The guards, the tellers, the customers, they were no longer bystanders. They were witnesses. "We laid the foundation with our own hands. I wrote every loan policy, met with every client. Elliot handled the politics, the social side. We balanced each other, black and white, back when that kind of partnership was rare. Risky, even. Clarence's gaze drifted to the window for a moment, as if he were watching the past replay beyond the glass. But as we grew, so did the whispers. People started asking why a colored man was signing their checks, why a Holman had his name next to a Radford. It didn't sit well with the investors Elliot wanted to attract. So, one night, over drinks, he told me he'd take care of things. I thought he meant smoothing over concerns, protecting me. Clarence paused, his lips tightening slightly. But a week later, I was locked out of the office. The locks had been changed, my name scrubbed from every file, and when I asked questions, they laughed, said I must be confused, that I'd never had any stake in the bank, that I'd imagined the whole thing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman near the exit placed a hand over her mouth. A young man in a business suit turned away, as if ashamed to look Clarence in the eyes. I took it to court. I hired a lawyer out of Columbus, best I could afford, but the judge barely looked at my documents, called them inadmissible before tossing the case, said the Radfords had been running this bank since its founding. Like I never existed. Clarence's voice cracked, but just for a moment. He didn't cry. He never had, not publicly. But the room could feel the pain in his words, the injustice buried so deep it had calcified into something unbreakable. I tried, Lord knows I tried. I wrote letters, visited newspapers, but no one printed a word. Elliot had the money, the last name, the power, and me? I just had a bag full of truth nobody wanted to carry. Preston Radford stood frozen behind the teller counter, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to breathe through the weight of the truth unraveling in front of him. He looked down at the ledger again. His grandfather's signature next to Clarence's. Undeniable. So I left Ridgeway, Clarence said, quieter now. Not because I gave up, but because I knew the fight couldn't be won. Not back then. Not when your skin said more than your words ever could. He looked around the lobby slowly, his eyes meeting every face. But I kept that ledger. I kept every piece of paper, every scrap they didn't destroy, because I knew someday someone would have to face this. Not just for me, but for every man or woman who's ever been erased just because they didn't look the part. Bradley Knox stood beside him now, his arms no longer crossed, his stance no longer aggressive. He wasn't sure what to say, or whether anything needed saying at all. "You didn't just lose a business, Mr. Holman," he said quietly. "They stole your legacy." Clarence turned to him, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes sharper than ever. "They stole my name from the walls of this place, but they didn't steal who I am." The silence inside Oak Ridge National was unbearable. Clarence stood tall, unwavering, surrounded by proof. Documents, cash, memories, all laid bare like bones dug up from the past. The crowd had grown. Customers delayed their errands. Employees left their desks. Even the coffee on the counter had gone cold. But no one moved, no one blinked. And then came the crack of leather against marble. Officer Bradley Knox stepped forward again, this time his hand firmly resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. "That's enough," he said, voice sharp like breaking glass. "I've let this go on too long. You've made your point, sir. Now it's time to leave." Clarence didn't flinch. His gaze didn't waver. "You really think I came here just to make a scene?" he asked calmly. "I came to reclaim what's mine." Knox's jaw clenched. The tension that had been building in the pit of his chest had reached its peak. The old man wasn't backing down, and worse, people were starting to listen. Behind the desk, Preston Radford looked paralyzed. His hands hovered over the old ledger, unsure whether to keep reading or hide it away. The documents had spoken. His grandfather's signature sat side by side with Clarence's on multiple pages. There was no denying the truth anymore. But truth had a price, and for the Radford family, that price could mean losing everything. Their reputation, their name, their control over the institution they had dominated for half a century. "Bradley," Preston called out weakly, "maybe we should slow down. Look into the papers." "No, sir," Knox snapped, cutting him off. "You don't know what you're dealing with here. This is manipulation. Fabrication. It's a stunt." He turned back to Clarence. "I don't care what kind of story you've spun or how long you've been practicing it. I'm not letting you turn this place into a circus. You either walk out or I make you." And then he drew his gun. Gasps burst across the room like a thunderclap. Several customers instinctively backed away. A mother pulled her child behind her. Employees ducked behind counters. The hum of tension exploded into fear as the steel of the firearm reflected the bank's fluorescent light. "Don't do this," Clarence said softly, still unmoved. "Don't become another man using power to silence the truth." Knox's hand trembled, just barely, but Clarence saw it. "I said sit down," Knox barked, the gun aimed squarely at Clarence's chest. "You've done enough." "And you think a gun changes the facts?" Clarence asked, his voice growing sharper. "You think fear erases the truth?" "No," came a voice, soft but firm, from behind the teller line. Everyone turned. Emily Wren, the youngest bank employee, barely 23, stepped out from behind the counter. She was petite, almost quiet-looking, but her steps were strong and purposeful. She held one of the old faded bills in her hands. "This is real," she said. "I've studied banking records. I recognize these stamps. These documents aren't fake." "Emily," Knox warned, his gun still raised. "Stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." "Yes, it does," she replied, stepping closer. "We all work here. We've all been told this bank was built by one family, that the Radfords started everything. But if that's a lie, don't we deserve to know?" The room had shifted again. Other employees started standing up. Josh, the teller who had sneered earlier, now stood with arms crossed and guilt on his face. Miriam, one of the senior account managers, moved closer to the desk where the ledger lay. Clarence remained still, the gun still aimed at him. But now it wasn't just him anymore. "You're not the enemy, Mr. Knox," he said gently. "You're just scared of what this means. I was, too, for a long time." Bradley Knox stood frozen, his knuckles white around the grip of the gun. He had always seen himself as the enforcer of order, the protector of rules. But now, as eyes filled with truth and shame looked at him, he realized he wasn't protecting order anymore. He was protecting a lie. "You'll regret this," Knox muttered, voice cracking. "You're breaking this town apart." "No," Clarence said, meeting his eyes. "I'm putting it back together." Knox's gun hand dropped slowly, inch by inch, before he finally clicked the safety and slid it back into the holster. The room exhaled as one. Preston Radford stepped forward at last, still visibly shaken. "Mr. Holman," he said quietly, I didn't know. I was told you were just a rumor." "That's how they erased me," Clarence replied. "They made me a story. A shadow." "Not anymore," Preston whispered. The silence that followed Officer Knox holstering his weapon was deafening. Clarence didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every person in that bank had just witnessed a line being crossed. A man pointing a gun at history itself, and that history refusing to bow. Across the marble floor, Preston Radford stood motionless, still staring at the ledger on the desk. His face was pale, his hands trembling. The name Holman stared back at him in faded ink, as permanent as guilt. I don't know what to do, he whispered. If I acknowledge this, if I bring it to the board, everything my family built, his voice trailed off. Clarence turned toward him, not with anger, but with a gaze that held something far heavier, understanding. I know what you're thinking, son, Clarence said quietly, that your name, your future, your whole foundation is at risk. But let me tell you something. Sometimes the cost of truth is exactly that. Everything you thought you had. Preston met his eyes. Do you hate me? He asked suddenly, his voice cracking. For being part of the name that stole everything from you? Clarence looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. I don't hate you, Preston, but I do need you to make a choice. Not because I want revenge. I've lived a whole life without what's mine. I've buried friends, worked jobs beneath my worth, seen doors shut in my face, all because a man with power said I didn't belong. And now, here we are, he paused. I didn't come for blood. I came for my name back, my dignity, my piece of the truth. Tears welled in Preston's eyes. He turned away from Clarence, staring out at the people in the bank, his employees, his neighbors, the townsfolk who had trusted the Radford legacy without question. My grandfather lied, he said aloud, his voice shaking. He built this bank on stolen credit, on someone else's shoulders, and I've been defending that lie my whole life without knowing. No one responded, but they didn't need to. The quiet was consent. Preston looked back at Clarence, eyes red, fists clenched at his sides. The board won't accept this. They'll bury it, threaten lawsuits. They'll come after me, too. I know, Clarence said. And if I side with you, I lose everything, my career, my name, maybe even my family. Clarence stepped closer, and if you don't, you lose yourself. The words hit like a blow to the chest. Preston closed his eyes. For 30 years, he had been raised to believe his grandfather was a pioneer, a leader, a man who built opportunity in Ridgeway. But now he saw the truth. Elliot Radford didn't build anything. He stole a legacy and left Clarence to rot in silence. I don't want to be part of this lie anymore, Preston finally said, voice cracking. But I'm scared. So was I, Clarence said gently. For 60 years I was scared, but I never stopped knowing what was right. Preston took a deep breath and turned to face his staff. Everyone, he said loudly, listen carefully. The room stilled again. You've all heard what Mr. Holman said. You've seen the documents. You've read the signatures. This man, Clarence J. Holman, is the rightful co-founder of this bank, and he was erased by the very man we've honored for decades. His voice grew firmer. I won't be silent anymore. I'm going to the board. I'll present the evidence. And if they fire me, if they try to shut me down, so be it. Gasps rippled across the room. Emily Wren stepped forward, her voice steady. You won't be alone, Preston. I'll testify. I'll speak for what I saw. Josh nodded. Me too. I said some awful things earlier, but I won't stand by and let the truth get buried again. Even Bradley Knox, still shaken, gave a subtle nod. Not approval, perhaps, but respect. Clarence blinked slowly. His chest rose with a deep breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. It was finally happening. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for seeing me. Preston stepped around the desk, extended a hand. Clarence stared at it for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and shook it. Two men, once separated by a legacy of injustice, now standing side by side in the face of a reckoning. Preston's hand trembled, but his grip was firm. You built this place, he said. I only inherited the shadow of it. If we rebuild it together, on truth, maybe we still have a chance to make it right." Clarence didn't reply right away, but in his eyes was something deeper than pride. Peace. It started with a whisper. By the next morning, it was a headline. "Local man claims he founded Oak Ridge Bank, presents explosive proof. Stolen legacy. New evidence shakes Radford family name. Truth buried 60 years. Now demands justice." The story spread like wildfire across Ridgeway and beyond. Local news stations camped outside the bank. Microphones were shoved toward Clarence as he walked out in the same old patched coat, carrying the same canvas bag that now the whole town wanted to see inside. Some hailed him as a hero. Others called it a publicity stunt. But no one could ignore him anymore. And the Matthews family? They heard it too. From their estate outside town, high in the wooded hills, Gerald Matthews, chairman of Oak Ridge Holdings and grandson of one of the bank's earliest investors, stared at the television screen with cold, calculating silence. His empire, built on generations of whispers and curated history, was cracking. And someone had handed the hammer to a man he thought had long since disappeared. At the bank, things were changing fast. Preston Radford had taken emergency leave. Not because he was hiding, but because he was preparing. With Clarence's permission, he scanned the documents, hired an independent forensic analyst, consulted legal experts. Everything came back authenticated. Clarence J. Holman had indeed co-founded Oak Ridge Bank in 1963 and had never signed over his stake. The case was airtight. But the Matthews family didn't care about airtight. They cared about control. So, on the fourth day, after Clarence walked into the lobby, a lawsuit arrived. Filed in county court, the Matthews family accused Clarence of fraudulent claims, intent to damage the reputation of the institution, unlawful possession of sensitive historical documents. Their aim was clear: bury him again, legally this time. "You okay, Mr. Holman?" Emily Wren asked quietly, sitting beside him in the community center where they'd been meeting each night. Clarence held the court papers in his hands. The thick legal language felt heavier than any gun. "I've faced worse," he said softly. "But I won't lie, this part, it's not easy." Preston sat across from him, flipping through documents, his suit wrinkled, eyes tired. "They're throwing everything at us. Motion to suppress evidence, claims that the ledger is stolen. Even character attacks. Someone's already started digging into your past." "They won't find much," Clarence said. "Just 50 years of being quiet." Preston looked up. Not anymore. He slid a folder across the table. "The county has scheduled the first hearing. But I've got something better. 2 law firms just offered to represent you pro bono. Civil rights lawyers from Cincinnati said they haven't seen a case this big since the Johnson Trust scandal." Clarence chuckled, just a little. "Didn't think my name would ever end up next to the word scandal." "Clarence," Emily said gently, "this isn't just about you anymore." And she was right. By the end of the week, hundreds had gathered outside the courthouse during the initial hearing. Some held signs. "Holman deserves justice. The truth can't stay buried. Reclaim the legacy." But others shouted back, "Stop dividing Ridgeway. Lies. We stand with Matthews. Don't rewrite our town's history." The tension was real and growing. Inside the courtroom, Clarence sat between his 2 young attorneys, Marla Jennings and Tyson Rayner, both sharp, relentless, and fiercely protective of the truth. The Matthews family's lawyers were old school. Expensive suits, silver cufflinks. They didn't bother looking at Clarence as they filed their objections. To them, he was still a nuisance, a statistic, not a man. But when Judge Lenora Hale, a black woman with decades on the bench, walked in and glanced at Clarence with quiet recognition. They knew this wouldn't be an easy win. "Mr. Holman," she said, once the proceedings began, "do you swear the documents you've submitted are original, and that your testimony today reflects the truth?" Clarence stood. His voice was clear, not loud, but it didn't need to be. "Yes, ma'am, every word, every page." Then he looked at the Matthews lawyers. "And I've waited 60 years to say them." As the trial unfolded over the next weeks, the courtroom became the center of the entire state's attention. TV crews set up outside. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Holman Truth and #Legacy Reclaimed. Preston Radford testified. So did Emily and Josh. Even Bradley Knox, his voice tight with guilt, took the stand to admit what he saw that day in the bank. But the Matthews team fought hard. They filed injunctions, leaked stories, tried to paint Clarence as unstable, a misremembering elder. But their efforts backfired. The harder they pushed, the more the public rallied behind the man who had shown up with nothing but a bag and the truth. And then came the turning point. Marla Jennings called a handwriting expert, a former FBI analyst, to the stand. She held up the original 1963 partnership agreement, and beside it, a property transfer form dated 6 months later, one used by the Matthews family to claim full ownership. "This second signature," the expert said, pointing to Clarence's supposed name, "was forged." Gasps filled the room. The judge leaned forward. "Are you certain?" "Beyond any reasonable doubt, Your Honor." And just like that, the courtroom shifted. What began as a question of history was now an accusation of fraud, cover-up, and systemic erasure. That night, Clarence sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse. The air was cool, the moon high. His hands rested on his lap, empty now. No more bags, no more ledgers, just the man. Preston found him there silent. "You okay?" Preston asked. Clarence looked up, a soft smile on his lips. "For the first time in a long time, yeah, I am." The final day in court arrived with no trumpets, no grand declarations. Just gray skies over Ridgeway and a quiet line of people forming along the courthouse steps. Some came with homemade signs, others wore suits. Many came simply to stand, to witness. Inside, the room was filled to capacity. Clarence J. Holman sat in the same seat he had every day for the past month. He wore the same coat, though Preston had offered to buy him a new one more than once. Clarence had refused, with a small smile and a quiet line. "This coat has walked the truth this far. It deserves to finish the road." Preston sat nearby. Not as a Radford anymore, not in spirit, but as a man changed. And beside them, Emily Wren, Josh, Miriam, the staff of Oak Ridge National Bank, no longer employees of a name but protectors of a legacy. Judge Lenora Hale entered, her robe flowing, her presence calm but commanding. "This case," she began, "has not been an easy one. It has asked us to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when history is manipulated, and a man is erased, not by accident but by design?" She looked at Clarence, then toward the rows of documents stacked in front of her. "Mr. Holman's claims have been substantiated through original documentation, verified by forensic experts, supported by testimony from individuals present at the founding, and corroborated by handwriting analysis. These are not allegations, they are truths." A wave of emotion passed through the gallery. Clarence didn't move. He simply breathed. "However," Judge Hale continued, "the legal statute of limitations for full asset recovery expired decades ago. Mr. Holman will not receive financial compensation or restored ownership of the bank." A collective breath of disappointment rippled through the room. Emily looked down. Preston clenched his jaw, but Clarence, he smiled. Just a little. "What Mr. Holman does receive," the judge said, her voice softening, "is something far more difficult to earn, and, in many ways more powerful, recognition. His name will be officially reinstated in the founding records of Oak Ridge National Bank. All internal and external documentation will reflect the truth, that he co-founded this institution in 1963, alongside Elliot Radford." Gasps. Then silence. Then quiet sobs from the back. "His contribution, long denied, will be preserved in both the bank's public history and the Ridgeway Historical Archives. A permanent plaque will be installed in the bank's main lobby bearing his name, and a scholarship will be established in his honor for underrepresented youth pursuing careers in finance and community development." Now it was Clarence's turn to be still. His eyes welled, but the tears never fell. They didn't need to. He had held them for 60 years. After the session ended, people lined up to shake his hand. Some apologized, others just touched his shoulder. No one said the perfect thing, but they didn't need to. Presence meant more than poetry. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters asked if he felt satisfied, if he would appeal for monetary damages, if he was angry about the limitations of justice. Clarence simply replied, "I didn't come for money. I came to be seen." And with that, he stepped down the courthouse steps, head high, shoulders relaxed, coat brushing against his knees like a banner of survival. A week later, Clarence stood alone inside the lobby of Oak Ridge National Bank. The renovations had been fast. On the wall behind the reception desk now hung a new bronze plaque, polished and proud. This institution was founded in 1963 by Clarence J. Holman and Elliot Radford, visionaries who believed in serving the people of Ridgeway. Clarence ran his fingers across the lettering. It was smooth, permanent. He turned, about to leave, when Preston approached behind him, holding something wrapped in velvet. "You forgot something," Preston said softly. Clarence took it in his hands and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a nameplate. Small, simple, gold-trimmed. Clarence J. Holman, co-founder, 1963. "We saved you a desk," Preston smiled. "No pressure. But it's yours if you ever feel like sitting down again." Clarence laughed, a warm, low sound like rust breaking free from old hinges. "I think I've earned the right to stand for a while longer," he said. "But thank you, Preston, truly." They shook hands, not as symbols of two sides, but as men, equal, honest, and free of the weight that once divided them. That night, Clarence walked the long road home under stars that had seen everything. The streets were quiet, familiar. He passed the diner where he used to eat before Elliot took his seat, the barber shop that stopped welcoming him, the church where the pastor had once hesitated to speak his name aloud from the pulpit. Now, people nodded, waved. A child riding past on a bike yelled out, "Mr. Holman, my mom says you're a legend." Clarence chuckled. "Tell your mom legends don't have sore knees." The boy laughed and sped off into the evening. Clarence looked ahead. There was no parade, no dramatic anthem, just the soft hum of a town beginning to see itself differently, because one man refused to let history close its book too soon. Back in his small kitchen, Clarence set the nameplate on the table beside the old ledger. He lit a candle. Not for himself, but for the memory of all those who'd never gotten their names back. Then he sat down, finally, and let the silence wrap around him. Not in loneliness, but in peace. He had walked through fire and come out whole, not rich, but real, and at long last, recognized. 2 years later. Spring had returned to Ridgeway, Ohio, with soft winds and blooming magnolias lining the sidewalks. Oak Ridge National Bank looked the same from the outside. Same red bricks, same glass doors. But the inside carried a different soul now. Where once there was silence and polished denial, now stood a quiet reverence. The bronze plaque honoring Clarence J. Holman had dulled slightly with time, but it still gleamed in the morning light. It had become a common stop for school tours, civic groups, and even visiting bankers from across the state. A symbol not just of truth reclaimed, but of what it means to make something right, even when it's late. Inside the bank's conference room, a small crowd gathered. Today marked the second annual awarding of the Clarence J. Holman Scholarship for Justice and Community Leadership, a fund established by the bank's new board, with Clarence's blessing, to honor students from underserved backgrounds who dreamed of changing the world through service, ethics, and courage. Preston Radford stood at the podium, older now, but more at peace than he'd ever been. He no longer carried the burden of a name he had once misunderstood, but instead wore it as a man who had made a choice and lived with its weight honorably. Clarence taught us that history can be rewritten, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with truth, perseverance, and dignity, he said, his voice strong and clear. The audience clapped gently. In the front row sat Clarence himself, now 80. His hair was thinner, his walk slower, but his presence remained as steady as ever. Emily Wren sat beside him, now head of the bank's Community Relations Department, smiling with quiet pride. When the scholarship recipient was called, a shy, 17-year-old girl named Amara Lewis, the first in her family to apply to college, Clarence stood with her on stage. He placed the medal around her neck himself, his hand trembling just a little. "Don't let anyone ever tell you you don't belong at the table," he whispered to her. "You built the table." She replied without hesitation. Clarence blinked back a tear. That evening, as the bank emptied and the guests trickled out into the golden light of sunset, Clarence stayed behind. He stood once more before the plaque on the wall. He didn't touch it this time, just looked at it the way one might look at an old friend, grateful, proud, and quietly at peace. Preston approached from behind. "You want me to drive you home?" Clarence shook his head. Think I'll walk a bit. The town's smaller now, or maybe I'm just bigger." They both laughed. Then Preston extended his hand again, the same way he had that day in court. Clarence took it, their palms warm with memory and meaning. "Thank you for not giving up," Preston said. Clarence looked into his eyes, a soft fire still burning behind his tired gaze.